Hi everyone, and welcome again to Creative Cakes by Sharon. Today I am doing a cake of Agnes, and she is the cute little character who appears in Despicable Me 1 and 2. So let's get started. In this tutorial I will be using two stencils, both of which are available in the link below. I've got an 8-inch round cake, a sharp knife, I've got a pizza cutter, an edible marker, a fluffy paintbrush, as well as some light peach coloured luster dust. I've got my offset spatula, roller, and I've got some black fondant, a little bit of red, a small amount of brown and white, and also some flesh coloured fondant, as well as some white chocolate ganache. I also have a cake board that I've covered already with some fondant, as well as a long piece of thick wire. So to create Agnes today, I'm going to try and achieve a bit of a raised effect to add some definition with her fringe and her cheeks and her nose. And I'm going to use this second template to make my cuts into the cake for those raised effects. Normally I would level my whole cake off, but I don't need to today. So the first thing I need to do to create this 2D character is to use my stencil with her printed face on it and cut around the stencil, taking off all of the excess bits of cake. You can see here, using this stencil, you don't waste too much of your cake. Now it's time to grab your second stencil and cut along the two dark lines. I use the ears to line up my stencil on the cake, and then using a sharp knife I cut along the top edge of the stencil, probably about 3 or 4 mil deep, and then starting from the outer edge of the cake I cut on an angle up towards the cut that I originally made. And the cake just falls away, as you can see, so I'm just trying to create an angled edge on the top part of the cake. Once I've finished with this, you can see that there's a bit of a ridge, and that's what we want to achieve. Once I'm happy with my shape, I turn it around and again at the other end of the stencil make an indentation and start trimming away the cake. This part is the bottom side of Agnes's face, so her chin and cheeks. So I want to create a soft round edge rather than a sharp corner. So once we lay the fondant over this, we'll get a nice raised surface. So now I just go ahead and fill the middle of my cake with my white chocolate ganache, and then replace the top part of the cake and proceed to cover the entire cake with the rest of the white chocolate ganache, making sure I get a nice even coating on the top and the sides. And then once I'm happy with this, I'm going to put it in the fridge for about 15 minutes. At this stage I'm going to prepare Agnes's ponytail just a little bit in advance so that it has time to dry, so by the time I finish the cake it's a little bit stiff. So with just some black fondant I roll it into a bit of a log and then roll it out into about the thickness of one of my fingers, and with a sharp knife I'm just going to neaten the two sides and the top of the ponytail to get those nice sharp corners that she has. It's a good idea now to just pick up the ponytail and smooth off any loose edges from your cuts that you've made, and then with a sharp knife I'm just going to score in lines into the ponytail to give her that cartoon-like appearance of hair. Make sure to do the sides as well. Once this is done, I'm going to grab my wire and snip it in half and insert it all the way up into the ponytail. After this, I need to leave it aside to dry. Now I'm going to make the little red scrunchie that goes at the top of her ponytail, and to do that I'm just going to roll out a piece of red fondant into somewhat of a rectangle and then create some pleats by just lifting up the fondant and creasing it with my fingers on the sides. So you can see you can easily make some pleats in the scrunchie and then just neaten up the edges by cutting off the excess and patting down any frayed bits. Now that my cake has cooled in the fridge, I'm just going to make sure I've got a beautiful smooth finish by using some boiling hot water and dipping my spatula into it, cleaning off any excess water and smoothing the whole cake. Now I'm going to work on creating Agnes's face, so I need to cut along the bottom of her fringe in order to make the stencil a little bit easier to use when we're putting on the fondant. So once I've placed the stencil on the cake, with my sharp knife I just score along the top of the stencil, and then with the back of a paintbrush I'm just going to rub it around the shape of her nose to create an indentation that I'm going to use and refer to later. Now with the flesh coloured fondant, what I'm going to do is roll a small ball in the shape of her nose and place it on the top of the cake where we made that indentation for the nose. I'm also going to add some raised cheeks to this cake, so I'm going to take a round ball and pat it in my palm into a bit of a mound. So I want the edges to be as flat as possible while still maintaining some height in the centre of the cheek. I need to do that for both cheeks obviously, so I'll repeat the process for the other one. Now using the stencil as a guide, I'm just going to place those two pieces of fondant onto the cake and they will stick to the ganache. Now I've just put the cake to one side while I roll out the flesh coloured fondant for her face, and then I'm going to grab the stencil once again and use it as a template to cut the fondant, so cutting along the top end and around the bottom. The bottom part is what's going to cover the front and sides of the cake, and I'm going to line up the top of my fondant with that indentation I made earlier in the ganache and lay the fondant down. I'm going to smooth the whole cake with my hand and use my pizza cutter to trim off the excess. I want to define the ears, so I'm going to use my fingers to get into those grooves and then make a final cut with the pizza cutter at the bottom to trim off the excess, and then with my finger I'm also going to make a little indentation for her ear. The next part of the face we're going to work on is the eyes, so I'm going to cut out her two eyes from the stencil, and then using some white fondant which I'm going to roll out to about 1 or 2 millimeters, I'm going to trace around the stencil with a sharp knife and then use the stencil as a guide on top of the cake to position those white of the eyes into the correct place. Once I'm happy with my placement of the eyes, I'm just going to gently lift off the stencil and smooth the edges of the eye so that it's more of a round finish. Now to make the other parts of the eye, in other tutorials I have generally cut out the shapes, but in this one I want to just show you another technique where you just roll in this case the brown fondant for the brown of her eyes, into a ball and place it over the top of the stencil. Once I've done this, I'm then patting down the edges, as you can see, so I can try to achieve a bit of a seamless edge between the brown and the whites of the eyes. So again with the other eye you can see that I'm making a little bit of a mound, similar to how I did the cheeks, and once I'm happy with the shapes I've achieved, I use my stencil as a guide to place this brown part of the eye onto the white that we've already put onto the cake and pat it down as best I can so that I can achieve a seamless edge between the brown and the white, but also a raised eyeball. The same thing goes for the center of the eye. I'm just going to create a little black ball which I'll then put on the top of the brown part of her eye and pat it down until I'm satisfied that it blends in, and then using 2 tiny balls of white fondant I'm just going to create a little reflection on both of her eyes. Now I've got my black fondant again, I'm going to work on making the eyebrows, so I'm going to roll out 2 fairly thinnish long sausages, and I'm going to keep working the fondant, moulding and rolling as I need to achieve a shape that is almost exactly the same as the stencil. And once I'm happy with the shape, I'm then going to use my stencil as a guide again to position the eyebrows onto the cake. Now with my knife I'm going to score the fondant with lines in her eyebrows so it looks a bit more realistic. Now to create the mouth for Agnes, what I simply need to do is cut along the bottom of her mouth, so cutting up from the side around the mouth line and then back down again, and I'm going to position it on the cake, and with the back end of a paintbrush or something smooth that you might have lying around, I'm just going to gently score along that template line to create her mouth impression. Now the idea here is to gently increase the depth of the impression. You don't want to press too fast too quickly because you might make a hole in the fondant. And don't forget to add 2 creases on either side of the mouth to finish it off. Now that I've done her face, I'm going to work on Agnes's hair, so I just have to roll out some of my black fondant, and with the top part of the template, which has got her hair on it, I'm just going to trace along that with my pizza cutter. Just be careful to lift up her little sideburns, and then cut around the top, leaving enough room for it to go down the front side of the cake. I'm gently going to line up my black fondant with the top line of the flesh coloured fondant and smooth all along that with my hand. I want to really make that indentation that we created into the cake with my hand so that we can see her fringe from the top of her hair, and carefully trim the fondant where it joins with her face and trim off all of the excess black fondant around her hair. Now I just have to create her two little sideburns, so just using some of the leftover black fondant, I'm just going to carefully cut out two narrow pieces which taper into a point and leave them aside flat just to dry a little bit, because if we put them straight onto the cake they will just flop down by the sides of her ears, so we want them to be a bit more stiff. Now, in the same way that we made the marks into the top part of the ponytail, I'm going to make indentation lines right across the top section of her hair with my knife, as well as across her fringe and down the sides of the cake. And with the back of my knife I'm just going to press gently to create a bit more definition into that crease. Using my fluffy paintbrush and my peach coloured luster dust, I'm just going to highlight her cheeks and gradually build up the colour until it's a shade I'm happy with. I'm also going to lightly dust my brush into the crease of her mouth just to create a little bit of a shadow and some more definition, and just brush a little bit onto her nose as well. Her two sideburns have had enough time to dry now, so with a bit of water I'm just going to adhere them to the sides of her face. I've got my board here which I've already prepared, and I'm just going to transfer Agnes onto the cake board. Looking back at the stencil, we can see a few eyelashes on Agnes's face, so using the black edible marker I'm just going to go around her eyes and add some tiny black strokes to create her eyelashes. You can also add a little bit more detail to the eyes with some black straight lines in the brown parts of her eyes. It all comes together fairly quickly now, so grabbing the ponytail, which is somewhat dry, I've inserted it into the cake and positioned her scrunchie on top. Now, because I've made this ponytail within the length of this video, it's not fully dry, so I need to trim it a little in order for it to stand stiff on its own. And there you have the finished product, Agnes from Despicable Me 1 and 2. I hope you enjoyed watching me make this cute little character, and thanks for watching.